doing today? Man, it is good to see you guys today. Hey, couple of things. All of you last Sunday that came early, stayed late, volunteered in one service, attended another, donated items for Easter. Thank you guys so much. Really appreciate it. Man, you guys did so much. It was such an amazing weekend. We had over 1,200 people here at New Hope last week, and we had so many people that made new commitments to the Lord, and that was such a blessing. You know what I love about you guys is so many times when people come to New Hope for the first time, we hear a lot of the same stuff. We hear stuff like, it feels like home. Everybody's so nice. People talk to me. People welcome me. And that's a credit to you guys. And so thank you guys so much. Thank you so much. One of my biggest fears is, and I hope this never happens, is that somebody comes here and they feel judged or they feel like they're not welcome or nobody says anything. Everybody's a greeter. Everybody, all of us are greeters. We have a team of greeters, but everybody's a greeter. And so thank you so much, all of you that are so kind to everybody that comes, and it makes a big difference. It really does. So, and I want to welcome everybody watching online. Thank you for joining us today. We are beginning a new series today on the book of Exodus. So will you guys do me a favor? Will you do me a favor? If you have like a normal devotion routine or whatever, will you pause that and will you begin reading the book of Exodus? We're going to spend the next couple of months in the book of Exodus. And so if you would do this, if you would read about 3 chapters a week, 3 chapters a week, we can read the book of Exodus together. And then at the end of this series, we'll wrap up the book of Exodus together. And so every week when we're reading the book of Exodus, you'll come to church and you'll be like, oh, I read that. I remember that story. I heard that. I saw that. I just read that in my devotion. And so if you'll begin that would be such a blessing. It would be amazing. And I think it would get all of us on the same page. And you'll be amazed at some incredible stories that are in the book of Exodus. Now, the book of Exodus really is an amazing book. It chronicles the children of Israel, the Israelites who are in bondage or in Egyptian slavery, and Exodus kind of tells the story of their journey from slavery toward what God has for them, the promised land. So their journey from slavery to the promised land. Well, kind of like a scene from the movie Vacation, things don't quite go according to plan. There's a lot of things that happen along the way, and we'll talk about that over the next few weeks. Now, what's interesting is that even though this book is written talking about a specific group of people that are on a specific journey, going to a specific place, what you'll find out is that through the book of Exodus, they're not a lot different than we are. And what's interesting is that most theologians all agree that in the stories of Exodus, there's a deeper meaning to each story. And that deeper meaning is relevant to each of us. For example, the children of Israel being rescued from bondage, from slavery, and beginning this journey toward the promised land kind of parallels our story. Before we gave our life to Christ, we were in bondage to sin. We were enslaved to sin. We were freed by Jesus, rescued by Jesus, and then we begin this journey toward what God has for us, toward the promised land. And what you'll find out with the children of Israel and these stories throughout this book is that they're not a lot different than we are. The things that frustrated the children of Israel frustrate us. The mistakes that the children of Israel made, we make a lot of those same mistakes. The things that caused them to pause and to even question God and to be like, why is this happening? Some of those things happen to us. And so as we look through this book, you're going to see a lot of yourself in the stories that you read and the things that we talk about. And what's interesting is that after the Israelites are rescued from slavery and they begin this journey to the promised land, they make some choices that aren't always good, and it causes them to wander and it delays them getting to the promised land that God had for them. And how many of us get in that same boat where we make choices and we make mistakes and we do things and we end up getting caught up in a circle and we end up wandering and we don't end up getting to the place that God has for us. And so you're going to see a lot of yourself, we're going to see a lot of ourselves in this letter. So we're going to be in Exodus. Today we're going to be in chapter 2. So it's right at the front of your Bible, Genesis, Exodus, super easy to find. We're going to be in chapter 2 today. But before we get to chapter 2, I want to talk to you about how the Israelites got to Egypt in the first place. So most of you are probably familiar with the story of Joseph. You heard of Joseph, the coat of many colors? So Joseph was a young man. He was hated by his brothers. They didn't like him. Joseph was kind of cocky. His dad favored him a little bit. He was a dreamer. And his older brothers didn't really like him. They were jealous of him. He was annoying. They didn't like him. So instead of just like beating him up or pulling his pants over his head or whatever, they decide, hey, let's kill our little brother. You think your kids are bad, right? I mean, they literally come up with this plan. Hey, we don't like Joseph. Let's kill the guy. Like, seriously, this is their plan. And so they kind of lure Joseph out in the middle of nowhere, and they're going to kill their little brother. And they see these travelers, these Egyptian travelers coming along the way. And they thought, you know what? Instead of killing him, let's at least profit off of him. So let's sell him. And so they sell their little brother to these Egyptian travelers to basically be a slave to these Egyptian travelers. So they buy Joseph. And what they do next is horrible. They take Joseph's coat that his father had given him, they kill an animal, they dip it in blood, and they bring this coat back to their parents and say, you know what? An animal attacked your son, attacked Joseph, and killed him. And so Joseph's entire life, his parents think that he's dead, and yet he's alive. And through an incredible, amazing series of events, and because of Joseph's faithfulness to God, his integrity, his attitude, which, I mean, who would have blamed him if he would have been bitter and angry and sour and would have hated the world? I mean, my gosh. But Joseph has an amazing attitude. He honors the Lord, he listens to the Lord, and through an incredible series of events, Joseph ends up becoming the second most powerful man in Egypt, second to only Pharaoh. Pharaoh is the most powerful man in the world at this time, and he basically says, this guy, whatever he tells you to do, you do. Joseph is running the country. And because of Joseph's connection with the Lord, and because he didn't get bitter, even though he was a victim of horrible circumstances, Joseph stays in tune with God. And the Lord had told Pharaoh through a dream that he didn't quite understand, that God used Joseph to interpret, that there was going to be a big famine all across the land. And Joseph is in charge of positioning Egypt where they can flourish during the famine. And so he does it through God's wisdom and through God's blessings and Joseph's obedience. They store grain, they store grain, they store grain, they store grain. And sure enough, this famine comes. And it's bad. I mean, it is the worst famine that had ever hit the land. And so everybody that has been impacted by this famine have to go to Egypt to buy food. And guess who's in charge of everything? Joseph. It made Pharaoh even more powerful. It made Egypt even far more wealthy than they already were, and builds them into an even greater superpower. And through another series of incredible events, lo and behold, guess who else needs food? Joseph's family. His brothers journey to Egypt to buy food because they're suffering from the famine like everybody else. And they have no idea who's in charge. Joseph recognizes his brothers, but his brothers don't recognize him. And through another miraculous series of events, Joseph finds it in his heart And if you get to know Joseph and his story, it's not too surprising. Joseph forgives them. Joseph reconciles with them. He helps them. And then he moves his entire family to Egypt. Aunts, uncles, cousins, brothers, everybody. He moves everybody to Egypt and gives them the best part of the land. And so that's how the Israelites get to Egypt. Is Joseph brought his entire family and they began to flourish and flourish and flourish. Fast forward about 400 years to Exodus chapter 1. There's a new Pharaoh, and it says right at the beginning of chapter 1 that this new Pharaoh did not know Joseph. There had been an agreement throughout the years of the Pharaohs because of what Joseph did and because of who he was, that they had an agreement that the Israelites could practice their religion. They could, basically have peace in the land. This new Pharaoh was not going to have it. He takes power in Exodus chapter 1. He surveys the land, and he's like, this is crazy. There are more Israelites than there are Egyptians. And he starts to think, man, if they get together and they revolt, they could take over our country. And so this new Pharaoh says this, I'm going to enslave all the Israelites. We're going to make them slaves. And I'm going to put out a decree that every new Israelite baby boy, every new Hebrew baby boy that is born, we're going to kill. This is the law, which leads us to Exodus chapter 2. This is the environment in which Moses is born into. There's a mother that gets pregnant. She has a baby. And as you could imagine, as most Hebrew women would have been scared to death that it's going to be a boy. And sure enough, it's a boy. She hides her pregnancy. When her baby's born, she hides her baby boy. But as little babies do, this little baby began to grow. And she could no longer hide him. And so she devises this plan. She's desperate. She doesn't want to see her little boy thrown in the Nile, murdered, to be killed. So she devises this plan. She puts together this basket, this little boat. She waterproofs it, and she doesn't know what to do. She puts her baby in this basket and says, God be with you. And lets him go floating down the Nile River. And as fate would have it, or better yet, God's plan would have it, the daughter to this new Pharaoh is down the river bathing. And she hears something. So she has one of her people go and find out what the noise is. They grab the basket, they open it, and lo and behold, there's a little baby in there. Now, they would have known right off the bat that it was a Hebrew baby, because what did the Israelites do to their boys on the 8th day? Circumcised them. And so she would have known that this boy was an Israelite. And instead of killing him, she adopts him. She names him Moses. And so Moses grows up being a Hebrew raised in the Egyptian palace. All the best schools, the finest food, the finest everything. But Moses still had a heart for his people. He had a passion for his people. Which is where we pick up in in Exodus chapter 2. So turn there. We're going to be in verse 11 through the end of the chapter. Many years later, and many years, meaning probably about 40 years, according to Acts chapter 7, it tells us that Moses is about 40 years old at this time. So he's a grown man. Moses had grown up, verse 11. He went out to visit his own people, the Hebrews, and he saw how hard they were being forced to work. He witnessed this on a daily basis. During his visit, he saw an Egyptian beating one of his fellow Hebrews. And after looking in all directions, which is interesting, to make sure nobody was watching, Moses kills the Egyptian, and he hides the body in the sand. The next day, when Moses went out to visit his people again, he saw 2 Hebrew men fighting. "Why are you beating up your friend?" Moses said to the one who started the fight, and the man replied, "Who appointed you to be our prince or to be our judge? Are you going to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Somebody had an iPhone. Somebody saw. Then Moses was afraid, thinking, "Everybody knows what I did." And sure enough, Pharaoh heard what had happened, and he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in the land of Midian. Moses was busted. He was found out. Somebody saw. And so Moses flees 300 to 400 miles southeast to the Arabian desert to live as a refugee. We pick up in the end of verse 15. When Moses arrived in Midian, he sat down beside a well. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters who came as usual to draw water and fill the water troughs for their father's flocks. But some other shepherds came and chased them away. So Moses jumped up, rescued the girls from the shepherds. Then he drew water for their flocks. And when the girls returned to Reuel, their father, he asked, "Why are you back so soon today? It wasn't normal." "An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds," they answered, "and he drew water for us and watered our flocks." "Then where is he?" their father asked. "Why did you leave him there? Invite him to come and eat with us." So Moses accepted the invitation. He settled there with him. In time, Reuel gave Moses his daughter Zipporah to be his wife. Later, she gave birth to a son, and Moses named him Gershom. For he explained, "I have been a foreigner in a foreign land." God's will is interesting, isn't it? What we're going to talk about today is God's will versus my will. God's timing versus my timing. My plan versus God's plan. God's timing, God's plan, God's will, it can be interesting for us. And at times it can be really frustrating. Because for whatever reason, God chooses to reveal his will like one step at a time. And that's so frustrating because we want to see the whole story, don't we? Like we want to see the last chapter. We want to see how the story ends. But for whatever reason, it's almost like we're in boxes, and every box we step, it lights up. And then the next step, it lights up. And the next step, it lights up. And the next step, it lights up. And it's like, why can't I see where I'm going? Why can't I see what I'm doing? Why can't you just show me, God, exactly what you want? It would be so much easier. But for whatever reason, God chooses to reveal his will, his plan, not on our calendar, not according to our time frame, but according to his. Because we often think that God's will, God's plan is all about us, but it's not just all about us. It's about other people as well. You know, God's will, God's plan, God's timing, it's kind of like driving in the fog. You know, you can only see right in front of you. You drive and you can't see the next intersection. You can't see the next turn. You can only see right in front of you. And you can't see the turn until you get to the turn. And God's will, God's plan, God's purposes, a lot of times are just like that. And that frustrates us. And we get impatient and we think God is not around and that God doesn't care about us because God chooses one step at a time to reveal his plan and his purpose and his will. And this was definitely the case with Moses. I'm sure Moses prayed every single night, "God, do you not see what's going on here? Like the Israelites are supposed to be your chosen people. And yet I see it every single day that my people are being abused, they're being beaten, they're being suppressed. And you're just sitting back and you don't care. Why do I care? And God, you don't care. Why are you not doing anything about it, God? Like, why in the world does it seem like you're not even here? You're absent. You just turned your back and you don't even know what's going on. And then Moses does something that we do so many times. We think God needs help. And we put our finger in God's plan, in God's timing. And this is certainly what happened to Moses. Moses comes to a point where he can no longer take it. He comes to a point where he's going to take matters into his own hands. God, if you won't do anything about this, then I will. God, if you don't care, I do. God, if you won't step in, then I will. And this decision that Moses makes starts in motion a series of events that he cannot undo, that he cannot change. There's no coming back from this. There's no fixing this. And so Moses kills a man. And I'm sure this Pharaoh had been wanting to get rid of Moses, and Moses gave him a reason. So let's talk about for a few minutes my plan versus God's plan. Let's talk about this whole timing thing and God's will versus my time versus God's time. And let's look at Moses' his choices. And let's see if we can learn some lessons from some mistakes that Moses made. The first thing that we see with Moses is this. Moses did the wrong thing. Listen, this is so important. Moses did the wrong thing for the right reason. For the right reason. Look at what verse 12 says. It says, after looking in all directions. Isn't that interesting? When you are in a situation where you got to look around and see if anybody else is watching, you know that something good is not going to happen. And Moses goes out and he's looking all around to make sure nobody's watching, and he kills this Egyptian. And then he further tries to cover up his choice by burying him in the sand. Moses knew what he was about to do was wrong. He knew this was not a play in God's playbook, which is why he looked around. Anybody watching? Can I get away with this? When we do the wrong thing, even for the right cause, we mess up that cause. But this is how we justify doing the wrong thing. We say, well, the cause, the end game. And this is what Moses does. Moses does the wrong thing for the right reason. Now, Moses had every right to be angry, didn't he? Yes, that's not wrong. Moses had every right to be frustrated. Moses had every right to have this burning desire to help his people and this burning passion for social justice and to help his people and to stand up for his people. Do you know where all that came from? That came from God. God gave him all of that. Nothing wrong with that at all. But Moses did the wrong thing for the right cause, and it ended up costing him everything. And man, how many times do we do this? Oh my gosh. How many times do we say the right thing the wrong way? Or we do the right thing with the wrong attitude? But the cause, as long as people know my cause, no, it's not just about the cause. It's about how you do it. It's never okay to do the wrong thing, even for the right reason. So let's look at a couple of these lessons, and that's the first one, is that we have to understand that even if the cause is just, that doesn't give us a reason to do the wrong thing. And we justify this all the time, especially with the way that we treat people. We say, well, I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that cause. I don't agree with that. My cause is the right cause. And so that somehow that gives me an excuse to treat people like garbage or to treat people like second-class citizens or whatever it might be. It's never okay. And we think that, well, you know what, as long as the cause is justified, no, it's never okay to do the wrong thing, even for the right reason. Does that make sense? The second lesson that we learn from Moses is this, is that God's ways are better than my ways. And for some of us that are seasoned, we've been through some stuff, man, oh man, could we tell some stories, couldn't we? Because a lot of times we learn this lesson through mistakes. And we come to the realization that, you know what, I think I'm good at figuring out my life, and I think my plan is better than God's plan, and rarely is that the case. God's ways are always better than my ways. Why? Because God sees things I can't see. God knows things I don't know. I make plans, but it's the Lord who directs my steps. The second thing that we see from Moses is this, is that Moses stepped in front of God. Moses stepped in front of God. I mean, I grew up riding dirt bikes, racing motocross. I mean, from the time I could walk, my dad had me on a dirt bike. And I grew up in Orange County, but a lot of my family, a lot of my cousins, they lived up in Apple Valley, Hesperia. And so when I was with my dad on the weekends, we would often go to Bell Mountain or go up to the desert. Apple Valley wasn't as developed as it is now. The whole Hesperia area, it was like just middle of nowhere. And so we would go riding there often. And one of the things that my dad always did that I really didn't appreciate until I got a little bit older is that when we would get to wherever we were setting up to go riding, my dad would make sure that my brothers and I, we all got on our bikes and we just rode around the area where we were at. Now, why would we do that? Because in the desert, man, you don't know what's out there. I mean, people bury bodies out there. They dump cars, TVs, back when TVs were big, refrigerators, washing machines. And then two, in the desert, sometimes there's these fissures where it's just so dry that it creates these like holes in the ground. And so what we would do is we would get on our bikes, and I was smaller and my dad had a bigger bike and he was bigger. And so we're following my dad around, all around the area, anywhere that we're gonna ride, we go around and we're just looking for stuff. What's my dad looking for? He's looking for stuff that could hurt us, stuff that would cause us to get in an accident, stuff that we would run over, stuff that we would hit, stuff that could hurt us, big boulders, big rocks, whatever. So we just would kind of survey the whole area. And once we did all of that, then we'd come back to camp and we kind of knew where we were. Now, the dumbest thing that I could have ever done, and I'm not going to admit or deny if I ever did this, would be to just go ahead of my dad and go full throttle and just say, "See you, Dad, bye," and just take off. That'd be the dumbest thing I could ever do. Because there could be things out there that I don't have the experience to understand and that I can't see and that I don't know about. And when you're a kid, you're not scared of anything hardly. The dumbest thing for me to do would have been to step in front of my dad. This is exactly what Moses does. Moses is frustrated. He's angry. God, why are you taking so long? Our people are suffering. They're in pain. They're being physically hurt. What is going on? And Moses decides, God, I'm tired of waiting on you. You're not listening. You don't care as much as I care. You don't love your people like I love your people. And so God, excuse me, but let me go first. And what happens, because we have a free will, God will let us do that. What happens is that we reap the results of that choice. Of my way above God's way. My plan above God's plan. My will above God's will. Was Moses' frustration justified? Yeah. Was God aware of Moses' frustration? Of course he was. Did God know what was going on with the Hebrew people? Of course he did. Does God know what you're waiting on? Of course he does. What about you? Are you tempted to step in front of God? Maybe you're single and you're so tired of being single. And it's so frustrating. And you're trying to do the right thing, and you're trying to have values, and you're trying to keep your morals, and even in this hookup culture, and you're just like, this is so hard. Like there's nobody out there that like has my values or my morals, or nobody that like believes in God, and it's just so hard to find. And the temptation is to step in front and say, you know what, God, I'm tired of waiting. So I'm gonna relax what's important to me, and I'm just gonna take what I can get. Don't do it. Do not do it. God has a person for you. In his time, in his plan, in his purposes, he will bring that person in his time, and it is far better to wait on the person God has than for you to pick the person. Come on. What about at work? You're so frustrated. It seems like everybody's moving up and you feel stuck. And you're like, there's so many shady people, and they're not doing the right thing, and they're corrupt, and they're moving up and getting raises and getting promotions. And here I'm working my butt off, and I'm doing everything I can to do the right thing, and I'm trying to do things in an ethical way, and I'm trying to do the right thing, and it just seems like I'm stuck, and nobody sees what I'm doing, and people are getting promoted that I know are doing the wrong thing. And the tendency, the temptation is to do this. The temptation is to fudge the resume a little bit, is to compromise so that you can get what you think you deserve. Don't do it. Let God raise you up. Let God put you where he wants you. Maybe you're thinking too small. Maybe God has something bigger and better than you could ever imagine. What would have happened if Moses would have just waited on God instead of taking matters into his own hands? We don't know. We don't know. Would God have done something? Yeah. And we'll wrap up chapter 2 by seeing that God has a plan. It doesn't line up with Moses' plan or timing, but God has a plan. Moses stepped in front of God, and he ended up having to flee his home, flee his people, and live as a foreigner in a foreign land. And we know this frustrated Moses because he named his firstborn son Gershom, which means I'm a foreigner in a foreign land. Thanks, Dad. Thanks for projecting your frustration with God on me. I appreciate that. Thank you. So a couple of lessons as we wrap up from the life of Moses, from these choices that he made. The first one is this: God leads, I follow. Do not reverse that order. There's an old song that says, where he leads me, I will follow. God leads, I follow. Say it with me. God leads, I follow. Do not reverse that order. We'll regret it every single time. I look back at my life at times where I thought God needed my help, and I regret it every single time. Number 2, the second lesson that we learn from this story is that God's timing is better than my timing. God's timing is better than my timing. And this is so difficult because we're so impatient. And yet God has a plan and he has a purpose. Even though Moses blew it, and he's living as a refugee in a foreign land, God is so amazing because God is not finished. Not only is God not finished with his people, but God is not finished, remarkably, with Moses. So just when you think God has given up on you, don't even let that thought stay in your mind for more than 2 seconds, because God gives Moses another chance. Look at the end of chapter 2. Years pass by. Again, about another 30 to 40 years. The king of Egypt died. Maybe that's what God was waiting on the whole time. Or maybe God was waiting on this. The Israelites continued to groan under their burden of slavery. Maybe they weren't ready to be delivered yet. They cried out for help. Here, the people, they're crying out for help. And their cry rose to God. You see, God's plan, God's purpose, his will is not always just about us. This wasn't just about Moses. This is about a lot of other moving parts that Moses was not privy to. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He looked down on the people of Israel and knew that it was now time to act. What are you waiting on? What are you tempted to put your hand in? What are you tempted to step in front of God because you're tired of waiting? Will you close your eyes with me for just a minute as we wrap up? I want to ask you just a few questions. And you can ask this to yourself between you and the Lord. So the questions are this: am I getting ahead of God? Am I trying to force the issue instead of waiting on God? Am I taking matters into my own hands? Am I willing to wait on God's timing and get God's results? Or am I going to step ahead of God and be left with my results? If you're here this morning and there's something that you're waiting on, a plan, a will, a purpose, whatever it might be, and you're about ready to give in, I want to encourage you right now, where you're at, give that to God. And say, God, I'm gonna remove my hand from this situation, and I'm gonna give it to you. Father, thank you so much for how relevant your word is. These incredible stories of successes and failures that are in your word to teach us. Father, help us to learn from the poor choices that Moses made. And help us, Father, to submit ourselves to your plan, your timing, your purpose, and to resist the temptation of stepping ahead of you. Father, I pray that you bless each person here today. Give them wisdom, strength, self-control, perseverance in whatever situation they're dealing with. In Jesus' name, amen. If you're here today and you need prayer, after this service, there'll be people right up here at the front that will pray with you about whatever needs that you might have, whether it's relevant to this message or something else. Would you stand up with me? Don't forget that you're never alone, you're never unloved, you're never without purpose or value, but you are who you are because of the artists who put you together. This is going to be a good book to study. God bless you guys. Have a great day. Hello, thank you so much for tuning in to New Hope this week. You know, the church doesn't stop when the video does. And make sure that you share this with a friend. You can even support what we're doing via the Give button here on the left. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss a single Sunday. And we cannot wait to see you this week, either in person or online. Have a great day.